Every major oil shock in modern history has triggered a recession. In 1973, oil prices jumped from $3 to $12 per barrel, a 300% increase, and what followed was a recession. In 1979, oil prices surged again, from $15 to $40 per barrel. And guess what happened? Another recession. And in 2008, oil hit $147 per barrel. And just months later, we had one of the worst financial crises the world has ever experienced. Now fast forward to today. In March 2026, oil is trading around $90 to $100 per barrel. And the world's most important oil choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, where about 21% of global oil supply flows every single day, is facing geopolitical risk due to tensions with Iran. If that choke point were disrupted, oil prices could spike to $150 or even $200 per barrel. So, to understand why oil shocks can cause recessions, you have to understand that oil isn't just another commodity like gold or wheat. It's different for three reasons. First, demand is inelastic. Basically, what that means is when oil prices rise, there aren't other alternatives people can immediately use. You can't just stop using oil. No matter what the price of oil is, you still need to drive to work, you still need to heat your home, and trucks still need it to deliver food or goods. So when prices of oil spike, consumption doesn't fall very much in the short term. You just end up paying more right away. Second, oil touches almost every part of the economy. It's a part of transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, plastics, chemical, heating, power generation. A 10% increase in oil prices, it doesn't just affect gasoline. It ripples through the entire cost structure of the global economy. And third, and this is a big one, is supply is geographically concentrated. About 60% of global oil reserves are located in the Middle East. And around 21 million barrels per day, that's about 21% of global supply, flows through the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz, it's a very narrow waterway and it's basically controlled by Iran and its navy. And any disruption there can send shockwaves through the global oil markets. And right now, Iran is threatening to shut it down. That's why oil shocks are uniquely destructive. To really understand how these things play out, we have to go to one of the first major oil disruptions that happened in 1973. During that time, Arab members of OPEC, they imposed an oil embargo on countries that supported Israel during something called the Yom Kippur War. Basically what you saw was oil prices exploding from $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel in just 6 months. That was a 300% increase, and it pushed the global economy into a recession through three different outlets. First, we saw inflation in America jump from 3.4% in 1972 to 12.3% by 1974. Basically, everything got more expensive. Gasoline prices jumped, heating oil spiked, diesel for trucking surged. And because oil is used across the entire economy, the cost of everything began to rise. And this is a lot different than the inflation we see today. This inflation, it wasn't because the government was printing massive amounts of money. It was because energy got more expensive and everything uses energy. The second big thing that pushed us towards a recession was that consumer spending collapsed. People everywhere in America, they suddenly had to spend far more on gasoline and heating, and that left less money for discretionary spending. So things like restaurants, retail, travel, entertainment, they all took a hit. And when all of this was going on, it put the Federal Reserve into a very bad dilemma. On one hand, inflation was rising fast, but at the same time, the economy was already weakening. But the Fed, they chose to fight inflation. The federal funds rate at the time, it rose from 8% in 1973 to about 13% by 1974. Higher interest rates also tightened credit, and that pushed the economy deeper into a recession. We saw real GDP fall by about 3%. Unemployment went from around 4.9% to 9%. And the stock market dropped by about 45%. But this wasn't just a United States problem. A lot of developed economies, they experienced recessions at the same time. And that type of shock, it marked the beginning of something we've never seen before, and that was stagflation. And that's when you have high inflation and high unemployment and slow economic growth. This was one of the first times the world ever experienced such a massive oil shock, so nobody could really predict how severe of a crisis it would cause. But then it happened again in 1979. In 1979, we had the Iranian Revolution. This was basically a major regime change in Iran's style of governance from a monarch to an Islamic head of state, and that disrupted global oil supply. Iran's oil production, it collapsed from about 6 million barrels per day to about 1.5 million. Then in 1980, the Iran-Iraq War began, and that created even more supply disruption. During that time, oil prices went from about $15 per barrel in 1978 to about $40 per barrel by 1980. That was a 167% increase in just 2 years. But this time, the economy was already in a bad state. Inflation was still high from the 1973 oil shock, and by 1979, US inflation had reached 13%. So when Paul Volcker became the Federal Reserve Chair in August 1979, he basically had one mandate: break inflation. And he was willing to do it at any cost. The Federal Reserve, they raised the federal funds rate to about 20% by December 1980. That was incredibly high, and at those interest rates, all types of credit essentially stopped. Mortgages became unaffordable, car loans evaporated, business borrowing collapsed. The most credit or debt-dependent sectors of the economy, like housing and auto, they were hit first. And the result was not one recession, but actually two. First was the 1980 recession, where GDP fell by about 2%, but it was then followed by a 1981 to 1982 recession, where unemployment peaked at 10.8%. That was the highest levels ever since the Great Depression. And the impact, it wasn't limited to just the United States. A lot of developing countries that depended on imported oil were pushed into debt crises. That's including the Latin American debt crises of 1982. Both of these are great examples about why energy independence is extremely important. Because if you don't have it, a lot of the future of your economy and even kind of the safety of your nation is based on the actions of other countries. And it's why you see countries like China push so hard and spend so much money on energy infrastructure. Because they know that with independent energy comes strength and power and leverage against other nations that don't have it. Now, if you fast forward to 2008, there's another oil crisis. But this time it comes with a twist, because we also have a housing crisis at the same time. From early 2007, oil prices surged from about $50 per barrel to about $147 per barrel by July 2008. That's a 194% increase in just 18 months. Gasoline also hit $4.11 per gallon. That was a record at the time. Now, look at what that meant for households. For a family driving 15,000 miles per year in a car that gets 25 miles per gallon, in 2007, gasoline cost them about $1,400 per year. By 2008, that cost jumped to about $2,500 per year. That's an extra $1,100 per year just for gasoline. Now multiply that across 250 million vehicles in the United States. That's about $270 billion less available for consumer spending. And you saw nearly 2% of the US GDP just disappear from the economy. And that same pattern we saw in the 1970s began to unfold again. Higher energy prices pushed inflation higher, households had less money for discretionary spending, retail sales weakened, travel slowed, restaurants suffered, and at the same time, businesses faced higher costs and growing uncertainty, so investment slowed down and there was massive layoffs. And again, the same thing as last time, the Fed was trapped. They were already dealing with the housing collapse and the subprime mortgage crisis, but rising oil prices were pushing inflation higher, limiting how aggressively they could cut rates. So by late 2008, the combination of collapsing demand for oil and financial crises, it actually caused oil prices to crash from about $147 in July to just $32 a barrel by December. That was a 78% collapse in 5 months. But by then, the recession was already well underway. Real GDP fell 4.3%, unemployment rose from 4% to 10%, the S&P 500 fell 57%, and housing prices dropped about 30% nationwide. That shock, it spread across the global economy, and it created the first synchronized worldwide recession since World War II. Now, if you fast forward to March 2026, oil is trading around $90 to $100 per barrel. That's already elevated compared to the $70 to $85 range we saw through most of 2024 and 2025. And once again, the global oil market is facing a familiar risk: the Strait of Hormuz. About 21 million barrels of oil per day flow through that narrow waterway. That's roughly 21% of global supply. Oil exported from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran all pass through this single choke point. And at its narrowest point, the strait is only 21 miles wide. So any disruption there can send immediate shockwaves through global energy markets. And right now, geopolitical tensions in the region, they remain elevated, and Iran, who basically governs this area because of where the waterway is located, is threatening to shut it down. Now, let's walk through what happens if the Strait of Hormuz is actually disrupted. If a major portion of that oil supply were suddenly cut off, prices could spike almost instantly. And remember, historically, we've seen this happen before. In 1973, oil prices quadrupled, and in 1979, they nearly tripled. So a major disruption today could easily push oil to $150 or even $200 per barrel. That would translate directly into gasoline prices, and in the United States, gasoline could jump from $6 to $8 per gallon. For that same household driving 15,000 miles per year, at $6 per gallon, gasoline costs about $3,600 per year. At $8 per gallon, it jumps to $4,800 per year. That's $2,000 to $3,000 more per year just for fuel. And you'd start to see a similar chain reaction happen just like it did in the past. First, consumer spending would collapse because households have far less money for everything else. Second, inflation would spike because higher energy costs ripple through transportation, manufacturing, and food production. Third, the Federal Reserve would be trapped. Inflation would be rising, and they wouldn't be able to cut interest rates to stimulate the economy, and they might even be forced to raise them again. Fourth, credit would start to tighten, so business investment would slow down and layoffs would begin. And that's when you would start to see massive unemployment rising. And the economy would fall into a recession. Nothing I'm saying right now is political. It's all about the mechanics of how the interconnected global markets work. The next oil shock could also be a lot more dangerous than past ones for a few reasons. First, global debt levels are way higher today. Before the 2008 financial crisis, global debt was around 200% of GDP. Today, it's over 350%. That means households, businesses, and governments, they have a lot less ability to just absorb a sudden cost shock. Second, central banks have less room to respond. Interest rates are already low, around 3.5% to 3.75%, and they're not in the 5 to 7% range that existed before earlier recessions. So if a shock hits, central banks have a lot less room to cut rates. Third, even though everyone always talks about renewable energy, and yes, renewable energy is slowly growing, transportation is still 90% dependent on oil. And global supply of oil is still heavily concentrated. About 60% of proven oil reserves, they still remain in the Middle East. And the Strait of Hormuz is the critical choke point. This means the world is still highly exposed to that same type of disruption that triggered past oil shocks.